Let's talk about MechWarrior 5 Clans. If you've ever wanted to dive into the Battletech universe, MechWarrior 5 Clans might pique your interest, but how does it stack up against past MechWarrior games? In particular, its shared namesake, MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries. Let's explore what you can expect from the latest release by Piranha Games. You'd be forgiven for thinking that MechWarrior 5 Clans is downloadable content for MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries. After all, they share the same title. But Clans is, in fact, a standalone game with its own story, setting, mechs, and even a different engine. The only reason I could find for keeping it under the MechWarrior 5 branding is familiarity. In the past, we've seen similar expansions in the series, with MechWarrior 2 to MechWarrior 2 Mercenaries, MechWarrior 3 to MechWarrior 3 Pirates Moon, MechWarrior 4 Vengeance to MechWarrior 4 Mercenaries, and MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries to MechWarrior 5 Clans. That's a lot of MechWarrior. It's a nostalgic move, and I don't think Piranha Games is trying to just ride the coattails of MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries. They've promoted Clans as being built to be the superior experience. But have they succeeded? It's difficult to summarize because it depends on why you play MechWarrior. I'll dive deeper into the specifics, but in short, if you're a fan of the more traditional battle mech simulators, Clans won't beat Mercenaries for you. However, if you don't mind an arcade-style shooter, then maybe this could be the experience for you, especially if you're looking for a strong narrative faithful to the source material, with a story that expands quite a bit on the Battletech lore. Clans is currently available on Steam for £42 or $50 US. It's worth noting that you could opt for a Game Pass subscription at a fraction of the cost and play it there instead. As you'll have guessed, this time around we're focused on the Clans, collections of peoples from outside the inner sphere, notable for their disdain towards the inner's use of contractions. I went into Clans expecting a loosely tied story, with gameplay more focused on the Clans' distinctive variety of mechs, particularly the iconic Timberwolf or Mad Cat for you inners out there. However, Piranha Games has gone above and beyond, and I'm thoroughly blown away by how well they've woven the story and delivered it through exposition and cutscenes. As a star commander for the Smoke Jaguar clan, you lead your star as the clans begin their assault into the inner sphere. During missions, you're treated to dialogue between your star's members, offering exposition on the ongoing story as well as their thoughts about the inners. And after missions, you're presented with decent cutscenes that add depth to the setting. You get the sense that Piranha Games have a strong respect for the lore, even though they're only presenting you with a very small part of it. Now, I've always loved MechWarrior games. They center around piloting towering robots wielding massive ballistic and energy-based weapons. What's not to love? Yet I found myself even more wrapped up in the story this time around, eager to push forward into the inner sphere to see where the story goes. Given the sheer number of missions as well, it's impressive that each one has its own dedicated part of the story, and Piranha manages to keep things fresh and from feeling repetitive or dull. Amid the overarching narrative are smaller interactions between your character and the members of your star, as well as your other clansmen. And it's great to see how respect for your leadership and the bonds with those who follow you into battle develop over time. Overall, I was impressed with the story. I wasn't expecting such a strong focus on it and was pleasantly surprised by the effort that went into crafting it. But you can't have a MechWarrior game without MechWarrior gameplay, and in any good MechWarrior game, the gameplay is always multifaceted, thanks to its simulator-styled approach, and Clans tries to stick to that recipe. Kind of. First, we have the actual piloting of the mech. You're given the option between modern and classic controls. Modern makes it feel more like a first-person shooter, albeit with a sluggish turning circle, while classic puts you in control of your mech's legs and torso independently. This is similar to later versions of MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries, and as in that game, you can switch between control schemes at any point. All in all, it's a great way to let newcomers get to grips with the game while allowing veterans to experience it how they're used to. Beyond the controls, the mechs feel great to pilot, each with its own distinctive handling, further affected by each pilot's affinity for that particular mech. As you explore the classic controls and further customization options, you start to get accustomed to the handling and begin forming a bond with a specific mech. However, this sort of attachment is somewhat overshadowed by the game's tendency to push you towards piloting heavier and heavier mechs as the game progresses, but more on that later. I was also glad to see the addition of jump jets on certain mechs. While expected, they add a lot of maneuverability, allowing the game to truly take off. However, piloting mechs requires more than just charging headlong into the enemy while smashing all of your weapon groups at once. A bit of finesse is called for, and even then there are other aspects of the game that can't be ignored. One of these aspects is combat management. As Star Commander, you're responsible for directing your teammates during missions. You can queue up commands assigning each pilot a different target based on their particular strengths and loadouts. For the first few missions, this can feel somewhat redundant as your star performs well enough by sticking to formation. However, as the difficulty increases, I found myself issuing commands more frequently, as relying on the AI's behavior was just not good enough anymore. Commands can be issued either by pointing at a target and using the context menu, or shortcut keys to assign a pilot to that target. Or you could simply switch to the battle grid, which gives you a strategic overview of the battlefield. This comes in really handy when trying to move your mechs to higher ground or to better engage the enemy. Pulling this up mid-battle can feel a bit frantic though, but it's often the difference between victory and defeat. In between missions, we hit a bit of turbulence. This is when you're presented with what I've dubbed the economy part of the game. This is where you manage everything from assigning new research and spending your pilot's experience points to customizing your mech. And of course, purchasing new ones. Veterans will know that you can't overlook this part of the game. It's integral to the simulators and they've seen vast improvements over the years. But in Clans, it feels like Piranha have overlooked these systems and we've taken a step back from Mercenaries and even MechWarrior Online, a game that is now 11 years old. The Mech Lab is, for lack of a better word, atrocious. It's an outright downgrade from what we've had in previous versions, and I can only surmise that it was an attempt to simplify accessibility for newcomers. But I reckon even newcomers would find it quite frustrating and unintuitive. One could even be forgiven for sticking with the default mech loadouts or even overlooking Omnipod loadouts entirely, especially since they're hidden behind a key press that's quite easy to miss. Just to explain, Omnipods are a specific feature of Omni-mechs and unique to the clans. Your typical inner sphere battle mechs are built with single purposes in mind. Some might be for assault, others for second line fire support, what have you. And to fulfill a different role, a pilot would have to jump into a different mech altogether. Omnipods, however, are modular hardpoints that can be swapped out, allowing an Omni-mech to serve multiple roles. It's with this that one would expect them to make a bigger deal of Omnipods in this Mech Lab. This leads me to another of the game's downgraded systems: how mechs and equipment is attained. In previous MechWarrior games, you'd salvage what was left on the battlefield after a mission, getting new equipment and at times even new mechs. Thus, my first instinct upon defeating an enemy mech was to try and disable it while leaving the chassis intact, hoping to salvage it for myself. In Clans, however, you can't salvage whole mechs. Instead, you only salvage these 3 generic types of components that can only be used to research new things. That's it. Instead, the only way to unlock new mechs is by increasing your level of honor, which serves as a leveling system that gates new Omni-mechs. Mechs are also unlocked in order of weight, from light to medium to heavy and finally assault, with 16 mechs in total, 4 per group. This gives the impression that heavier mechs are superior, and the increasing tonnage limits of missions reinforce this. I haven't yet encountered a mission where I was forced to use lighter mechs to meet a strict tonnage limit. That's a shame, as some of my favorite builds in the past have always been on the lighter mechs. To make it even more silly, pilots have affinities that can be assigned to specific weight classes and mechs. You only get 5 affinities, and these affinities are selected permanently. I suspect most players are just going to wait until they've unlocked heavy and assault mechs before assigning them. Why bother with lighter mechs when the game seems to favor heavier ones as time goes on? And if you could salvage inner sphere mechs, imagine how cool it would be to have banter between squad mates, poking fun at one of them for piloting an inferior inner sphere mech. Given all of the above, it becomes abundantly clear that Piranha Games decided to move away from the traditional battle mech simulator that we've seen in previous releases, including Mercenaries. From the way you salvage components to the layout of the Mech Lab, it feels as though things were simplified to draw newcomers to the franchise, but as I mentioned, I think even newcomers would find it tiresome to work with. It's no surprise that the high point for me is still the story, but the real question is whether they managed to hold on to the essence of the original simulators, and I don't think they did. As mentioned, in MechWarrior, the parts between combat is equally as important as the combat itself, and in Clans they've made those parts frustrating and, quite frankly, a little bit dull. Let's chat about the difficulty of the game. Everything put aside, if you pay attention to the various aspects I've mentioned, you can make the game significantly easier for yourself. You're given 3 difficulty options: story, normal, and hard. It's a non-competitive game, so you can choose the experience that you want. This is further reinforced by the fact that there are no achievements tied to reaching milestones on specific difficulties, and you can change it whenever you feel like it. To dig into these details a bit, the game difficulty can vary wildly. You really have to pay attention from the very start of a mission, or you might regret your decisions later on. And as a metaphor for life, even if you did everything perfectly, you might still end up regretting your decisions later on. You might get lucky on a mission and find an ammo crate to restock your ammo-bound weapons, or if you're really lucky, you'll come across a repair bay to patch up your most damaged mechs before the final fight of the mission. More often than not, though, you'll reach the end and realize you wish you hadn't used up all of your LRM ammo early on, or that you'd been more cautious and avoided losing an entire weapons group in the first encounter. And seeing that the missions can last from 30 minutes to an hour with no saving or checkpoints, it can be incredibly painful if you run into a bit of bad luck after the halfway mark. This is particularly frustrating when a mission begins with 10 to 20 minutes of busy work where you're just walking around from one objective to another scanning for contraband before you finally see some action. Sure, you approach cautiously as you should, but eventually the fight can devolve into a survival challenge with wave after wave of fresh mechs sent against your star as your armor and munitions are slowly depleted. I mean, it's MechWarrior and this is part of the game, but in clans it gets incredibly frustrating to have to restart a mission and redo all the busy work again. Adding to this frustration is the occasional mechanic where my mech is simply destroyed because it stubbed its toe on a tank that's too strong to be crushed, turning progress into a real chore as I work my way through the campaign. All of that aside, as I mentioned earlier, the game wants you to approach it as a star commander, guiding your mechs to strategic positions and handling encounters with care, rather than recklessly charging and hoping superior firepower will win the day. It wants you to get to know your pilots and their mechs so you can position them correctly for the engagement. But at the same time, it doesn't really give you any feedback on how well a pilot is suited to a mech or how well they perform. You kind of just have to play it by ear and wing it. It's also never too late to issue a few well-placed commands that can turn the tide of battle. You may have been ambushed and everything seems frantic, but you could still turn things around by moving some of the mechs to higher ground while focusing fire on smaller enemies. Eventually you can all band together to take down the assault mech that's been giving you trouble. Now that's where modern controls can cause trouble though. As mentioned before, you can use modernized or classic controls. Modernized controls let newcomers get the hang of piloting a mech, and if this is your first MechWarrior game, that's probably where you'll start. But I highly recommend trying out classic controls once you've got the swing of things. With classic controls, you can point your mech in a direction, engage the throttle, and let it run while you issue commands, while with modern controls, you're just going to end up standing there the entire time, hoping to avoid the ERPPCs that are being fired at you. And believe you me, high-tiered enemies will absolutely hit you, and even higher-tiered enemies will spot you standing still from a mile away and seize that opportunity to punish you for standing still. I've been playing on normal difficulty, and to summarize the experience, frustration. The game punishes you when you're careless, and it punishes you when you're not. You could pay attention to every minute detail, and yet at the end of the mission you're faced with wave after wave of enemies and some big boss fight. And if you fail at that point, I hope you enjoyed the mission so far, because you're going to be doing it again. And don't get me wrong, I'm not one to shy away from a challenge, but when that challenge involves spending another 30 minutes walking between checkpoints, it can get a little tedious. With that in mind, I really wish there was just some kind of a checkpoint or save system in place. With the graphics, we hit some more turbulence. Let me address performance first. At 1080p without DLSS, I was getting about 50 to 70 frames per second. Switching DLSS on to balance yielded good results, boosting that frame rate up to around 90 to 100. With frame generation turned on, things really took off, reaching 180 to 200 frames per second, a massive improvement. Switching to ultra-wide 3440 by 1440, I saw similar frame rates but with a much lower 1%, which I could really feel in stuttering. Without DLSS, I was getting between 40 and 60 frames per second, with the game mostly hovering around the lower end. DLSS switched on to balanced gave me a bump up to 80 to 100 frames per second, and frame generation brought it home at 150 to 170 frames per second. I should note the above metrics were captured with all settings on maximum and viewing distance set to far. My rig isn't bleeding edge, but I like to think that it's still on the top end with a 5900X and a 4080 Super kicking around in there. So I can't help but feel that those on lower end hardware, which should still be 100% acceptable to play on, would have to drop quite a few settings just to achieve a decent playable frame rate throughout. Especially since frame generation is only available on the 4000 series of graphics cards. This leaves me miserable and thinking that once again DLSS and frame generation are being used as a crutch by developers to avoid spending time properly optimizing their game. We've seen it before and I'm sure we're going to see it again, and it's in my opinion a really poor showing from Piranha Games. Now you're probably wondering, does it perform so poorly because it looks amazing? No, the graphics are fine at best, nothing really living up to Unreal Engine 5 expectations. There's little that stands out as being objectively better than what we had in Mercenaries. Even during combat, it feels that the developers try to maintain this performance by using 2D sprites for explosions. The same goes for some of the weather effects, which just appear as 2D flying clouds that come towards you. None of it makes you think, oh, I see where my frames went. It's all just blech. Even the environmental destruction feels equally lackluster. When walking through fields of grass, you leave no sign of your passing, no footprints of parted grass. Bumping into most trees and structures causes them to simply crumble in on themselves, disappearing into the map rather than reacting appropriately to your mech in some meaningful way. Even when massive dropships fly close to the ground, belching big clouds of 2D smoke, the foliage doesn't react, it just stands there stoically. Even the mech physics feel off. They don't react correctly to inclines or slopes in the terrain, and often even just float a few feet above it. And the details aren't spectacular either. Your mechs look like mechs, with the same level of detail we saw in Mercenaries. Nothing stands out as particularly spectacular or as a step up from Mercenaries. Nothing that really cost you the frame rate that you're getting. And finally, my last gripe is the overly intrusive HUD. It's huge and constantly obstructing your view. I found myself playing most of the game at double zoom just to try and steer my focus past it, especially coming from the clean, well-structured HUD of Mercenaries. Lore-wise, it could be argued that it's meant to represent the clans' superior technology, but it feels like a step backwards to me. To wrap up graphics, all in all, I'm here to play a MechWarrior game, and as long as I can distinguish between the Timberwolf and the Catapult, I'm mostly happy, but I'd like to do that at a frame rate that respects the hardware on which I'm running the game. Onto sound and music, the outlook is still a little bit grim. Don't get me wrong, the music is great. It fits not only with the MechWarrior universe, but also the clans themselves, so well that I can understand why you'd be tempted to grab the soundtrack separately. It has the right blend of orchestral elements to complement a sci-fi space opera and melds seamlessly with the game. You might not notice it while you're playing, but you'd definitely notice it if it was suddenly turned off. Moving on to sound design, this is where things are less than stellar. It's hard to put into words other than to say that the sound felt boring. There's no real dynamic range, with everything sounding about the same. You can distinguish between a PPC, a pulse laser, and a regular laser, sure, but none of the weapon sounds will blow you away. They won't make you turn your head and wonder where did that get fired from. Speaking of being blown away, even the explosions feel completely muted, whether you're inside or outside your mech. When you see a mech's core go critical and it results in a 2D explosion, you'd at least expect to hear a satisfying boom, not just a muted puff. And fine, I'll admit that I place a huge emphasis on sound design. I am a stickler for it, but at this point I can't help but feel like I've missed some setting in the game that's causing the sound to come through dull and muted. And believe me, I checked. I even switched between 3 different headsets with 3 different outputs. Unfortunately, there was no fixing it. In fact, there isn't much in terms of sound settings at all, but I'm going to chat about that a bit more later. I'm not saying the sound is terrible and you're better off playing on mute. It just feels like it was an aspect of the game that was completely overlooked and could have used a little bit more attention.
Scan mode engaged. Target destroyed. Incoming missile.
Diving into the settings menu, we've got some rudimentary multiplayer settings, followed by extensive mech settings, and I like to see this large amount of settings to really customize how you steer and control your mech. Everything from enabling arm lock to mech control mode to even enabling throttle decay if you wanted to. On the graphics, we've got our usual culprits. The game supports ultrawide out the box, and I switch between the 2 resolutions while playing. You've also got your DLSS settings or FSR depending on your specific flavor of upscaling. Then in terms of quality settings, we have a good selection of tweaking as we can expect from a game built on the Unreal Engine. I've played with everything on maximum and viewing distance on far, and I still didn't really get the performance trade-off. The audio menu speaks to my opinions on the sound design in the game with a lackluster collection of settings. I mean, you can adjust the master volume or independently adjust music volume, sound volume, and voice volumes. But that's it, there's no settings for dynamic range or speaker configuration. It could be that the game picks this up from whatever Windows is set to, or that it simply doesn't care. My money's on the latter. On the controls, you can adjust your sensitivities on the axes independently, as well as inverting those axes. Then you have all the key bindings for the game, and given that it's a MechWarrior game, there is a lot to be rebound. Even if you don't plan on rebinding anything, it's still worth taking a look at this menu just for the available keys. You you might learn something new. If you're playing on controller, you can change the layout between alternate configurations, but there's no actual rebinding here. I suspect, as usual, that most people would simply rebind things in the respective software that comes with their controller. Joystick players will rejoice, though, in knowing that they can entirely set up their joysticks to play the game with the same rebindings available to keyboard and mouse. I will note I played on keyboard and mouse and I found zero limitations to speak of. Lastly, we have menus dedicated entirely to the End User License Agreement privacy policy and an entirely separate menu for language selection. This feels weird, as though it could have fallen into another menu somewhere, and we could have rather seen an accessibility menu, for players with different needs. This is a little bit sad to see for a game that costs as much as Clans does, especially in today's day and age when most games include accessibility options to cater to people's needs. Let's talk about the ethical fine print for a second. MechWarrior 5 Clans launched as is with no pre-order bonuses or early access that I'm aware of. There is a collector's edition that includes a digital art book, the soundtrack, an Omni-Mech technical readout, as well as in-game platinum mech patterns and the Timberwolf variant with a unique weapon loadout and skin. It's nothing too fancy, and for £25 or $30 it seems to be more of a supporter type package. I will note, however, that the soundtrack and digital art book are currently only available in-game, which is a bit of a weird thing considering that's where you'd go to listen to the soundtrack anyway, right? Then when booting up the game, you're faced with a couple of unskippable title screens along with an epilepsy warning before hitting the press any button screen. The game takes a short while to get going, not the slowest I've seen, but nowhere near as fast as something like Wild Bastards, for instance. It's also a hefty install, taking up around 60 gigs. Now this can be forgiven given the 25-hour campaign, which includes fully voiced cutscenes. And speaking of that campaign, while it's around 25 hours long, give or take, that's pretty much it. It doesn't offer the same level of replayability as Mercenaries that, aside from replaying the campaign on a harder difficulty, this further cements Clans as a story-driven, one-shot experience meant to be enjoyed just for its narrative. Finally, there are no microtransactions in the game, and aside from the glaring performance issues that cause the game to rely heavily on the LSS or FSR, there's not much in terms of shenanigans going on here. MechWarrior 5 Clans is a tempting title to pick up if you're new to the franchise. It's accessible from a controls, progression, and story perspective, slowly introducing you to BattleTech concepts that you might be hearing about for the first time. The swings in difficulty might put you off though, but there's no shame in switching down to story mode. And though the performance issues with graphics and sounds are annoying, they don't break the game, and it delivers a solid story through its campaign, something that many players fatigued by the open world format of the previous entry may find to be a welcome change. However, can I recommend the game? Given that it's on Game Pass, it's hard not to. But considering all the issues mentioned in this review, I wouldn't recommend paying full price for it. Why not try out Mercenaries instead, as you can get that for nearly half the price on Steam? It might be worth waiting to see if they address these concerns in future patches. I know Piranha Games already has plans for the next patch, and it's good to see they're still paying attention. After all, they updated MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries well into its lifespan, even adding the modernized control structure at a later stage. The question is, will they consider overhauling fundamental game systems like MechLab? Maybe. Ultimately, I can only relay my experience, and I have really enjoyed the story while suffering through the frustrations with Clans in my 10+ hours of playtime. I fully intend to finish it, but I wouldn't recommend grabbing it at full price as is. However, if you already have a Game Pass subscription and you're itching for more MechWarrior gameplay, why not give it a try? Thank you so much for watching. Why not let me know in the comments down below what your favorite mech of all time is? And while you're at it, why not leave a like and subscribe? As much as I like making these videos, I enjoy it even more knowing that someone else is appreciating it. I'll see you all in the next video. Please take care of yourselves out there. Bye bye.
It is finally time for the children of Karinsky to return home!